It's a pleasure to be here today and to be back at, I think this is our fourth PharmaFuture Knowledge Conclave, and focusing on new commercial models to create customer value. My background is I started my career at MSD in the United States, spent 25 years with them as a sales rep, and then ended up heading up U.S. marketing for several years and being the commercial head of the vaccine division when we created it back in 1991. From there, I went on to join a large wholesale distributor in the U.S. called McKesson, and I actually created a pharmaceutical services business for them. Back in the days when times were really changing, this was in the late 90s to the early 2000s when there actually was a new commercial model hitting the U.S. at that point in time. And for the past 10 years, as Garth said, I've been working with Indegene, helping them build out the global model, really addressing this new commercial model in many different markets. And so what I'm going to try and do in the next few minutes, just as an introduction to our two keynote speakers, who will focus on the China market, is to give you kind of a perspective from a Western view of how the changes took place in the U.S., what changes evolved, and how this really started a snowball effect throughout Europe and now to emerging markets with big pharma. And so we'll look at this whole evolution of the commercial model and really how it started from a model that looked in the past basically at blockbuster drugs and has evolved gradually to the point where today in the U.S. we're looking more at a commercial model towards healthy outcomes. And so if you look at the drivers of these changes, and I'll go into them in a little more detail in a second, a lot of it has come from things in the past, whether it's R&D productivity or the lack thereof, or generic substitution of big brand products, to more recently, we just implemented a significant healthcare reform change with Obamacare this past year, and that was an eye-opener to a lot of providers and payers within the U.S. Pharmaceutical system. And so as we look at what we focused on, we went from an era of blockbuster drugs that drove kind of the growth of pharma, and these were in chronic care type areas, cholesterol and hypertension, diabetes, to an era that we're just pulling out of right now, where a lot of the major multinational drug companies decided that not only would they have a portfolio of chronic care products, but they'd also go into specialized products, whether it was in oncology or orphan drugs or diagnostics or whatever, to try and balance out the portfolio. And then as these drivers of change put it more into healthy outcomes and looking really at outcome-based medicine, the whole strategy and tactics of the industry in the West have been shifting. And they've been shifting a lot from the customer standpoint, from an exclusive kind of focus on the physician to more of a balanced focus on the physician, patient, and in many cases, the payers. So if you look at how have these systems and policies been changing, and what's really caused this change towards health outcomes or healthy outcomes, if you look at consumerism, as a major driver of that, well, you can't look at a newspaper or something on TV in the U.S. today without seeing activist groups, whether it's the Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation or whatever, where you get consumers really actively participating in understanding and driving the move towards new therapeutic changes in their area. So we see that this empowerment of patients through the internet, through coalitions, really helping to drive this change towards healthy outcomes. With respect to healthcare reform, we just went through Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, which is now opening up access to new medicines and to new providers for I think the latest count was 7 million new patients in the U.S. landscape. Looking at a value-based approach, which we'll talk a little later about, and this whole explosion in healthcare IT or information technology where you've got electronic medical records that now can be shared between institutions, between payers, between providers, that again is driving towards a focus on health outcomes or a healthy lifestyle for many of these patients. The whole digital era with social media and mobile technology. I'm under the care of a primary care physician who has her own website, who contacts me once a week on my phone, on my cell phone, to ask if I've been monitoring my blood pressure. So I have a one-to-one dialogue at any one given time with my primary healthcare provider. And then the whole area of looking at value-based pricing and reimbursement, as well as value-based types of designing of clinical trials to look at comparative effectiveness of standards of care versus new standards of care to, again, drive this move towards healthy outcomes. And this has become, it's a very gradual change in the U.S., but it's a dramatic change in the way manufacturers and healthcare providers have been thinking about this whole landscape as far as new commercial models over the past few years. Now, another dramatic change that we've seen is the whole way that this has been communicated throughout the system. If you look back in 2007, in the U.S., we peaked out at about 100,000 pharmaceutical reps. And since then, there's been this gradual decrease, about a 40% decline through last year in the total number of sales reps in the field. But in a balance to that, we've seen that with respect to physicians that are using e-channels, to gain their information and knowledge about pharmaceutical products, about healthcare, there's been a dramatic increase over the last 5 to 7 years. And currently about 9 out of 10 physicians in the U.S. are accessing technology and pharmaceutical information on a daily basis through either a cell phone, a laptop, or some type of PDA or computer. So, 3 things to really keep in perspective as we hear our speakers today really are, more than ever, you're seeing a shift towards value-based outcomes in drug development. And what does this mean? Well, it means that the major U.S. companies, at least in designing clinical trials for U.S. and Western Europe, are building protocols in place that can be executed in market so that when a physician actually has a patient, they're able to treat that patient the same way that company's medical research department did in their clinical trials. And this wasn't always the case in the past. Clinical trial outcomes were much different than real-world and life outcomes in a clinical setting in the actual office practice. And now the trials are being modified to mirror more what happens in everyday practice. You're getting a lot more increase in specialty medications. So as manufacturers have decreased the focus on trying to find the next blockbuster for hypertension or cholesterol, they're looking at more of these niche areas that weren't satisfied before that are now able to command a higher price in the marketplace due to a relatively smaller patient population. And the real thing that we're going to focus on today is Big Pharma's continued interest in the rise of emerging markets and how this is going to have a dramatic impact for shareholders of these companies in the future. So if you look at just how important emerging markets have been over the past 15 years, if you can see the 2 lines, the red line is the emerging countries and the blue line are the developed countries. And you can see some pretty clear trends here. On this axis here is percent growth. So while back in the mid to late 80s, it was about the same growth, 3 to 4% in both emerging and developed markets. You can see that the trend line for emerging markets has dramatically gone up to somewhere in the 6 to 7% annual growth rate, and the trend rate for developed markets, has kind of gone down and flattened, slightly rising, mostly due to newer product introductions that have picked up in the last year or so. But I think a large part of this decline here was due to the collapse of the financial sector in 2008. But you can see a clear trend here that emerging markets are becoming much more important to both the executives and the shareholders of major global pharmaceutical companies. And so if you look at these pharma emerging markets, they currently include about 70% of the world's population, and they generate about 31% of the gross domestic product within those countries. And they'll account for about 30% of global pharmaceutical expenditures within the next 2 years. And specifically, the BRIC companies are expected to be among the top 10 global markets by 2016, and accounting for pretty much near 250 billion US dollars. And I can remember not too long ago when the whole US market was only worth $100 billion, and that was about 8 years ago. And now you've got the BRIC markets that in 2 years are going to be almost triple that in value to a pharmaceutical manufacturer. And the irony of this is that many of the pharmaceutical companies today don't have anywhere near what the potential is in sales from these emerging markets. Most, maximum 30% of their annual revenues are coming from emerging markets. So there's a lot of attention being paid on emerging markets, a lot of growth forecasted within these markets, and a lot of expenditures targeted towards the emerging markets throughout the world for pharma companies. So how do you build an effective business model in these emerging markets? Well, we're going to talk about that through our keynote speakers today, and also with the panelists when we get to our panel discussion. But if you look at what has happened in the evolution of the business models that have been adopted in emerging markets by multinational companies, there's kind of this scenario where there's no one size fits all. So depending on the market and depending on the company, you can have different approaches. It can either be price volume based, that will go into a market and offer products, customers at prices that they can afford in certain volumes. There can be a market-based strategy, a collaboration-based strategy. I think fewer companies are going towards an innovation-based strategy in emerging markets due to some paucities in the pipeline. And then there's, specifically in the U.S., there's more of a tier-based approach that's been taken as managed care and many of our payers are granting access to new pharmaceuticals on either a prior authorization basis or on a tiered pricing copay basis. And some of these models are being looked at by pharmaceutical multinational companies for emerging markets. But I really think the winners will be those companies that know how to best balance their global competencies with the approaches that are needed, any varying amongst these approaches in the local territories, in the local markets. And so it's going to be different for every local market. I think the leadership of the local markets will have to drive that change and drive that new consumer model that best fits the needs of that market. The one key is going to be affordability, I think, in every emerging market. And whether that's through price reduction, tackling different government policies, price capping, reimbursements, all of these have been used in Western markets in the U.S. I suspect that, some variation of these affordability aspects will be used in emerging markets, and we'll hear more about how they're being used in the China market, by our speakers today. But all the other things are very, very important. If you can't get the medicine to the hospital or to the patient, it doesn't matter how aware the providers are or how adherent the patients are. They'll never have the luxury of ever using the product. So just before we move into the keynote speakers, a couple points to kind of ponder as you go through their presentations. First would be really how do we ensure the success of a new commercial model in the China market? It's really, I think, understanding what are some of the unmet needs and challenges, in this market, whether it's a national market or in the local territories, and tailoring, long-term strategies to meet that. And it's not a sprint; it's a marathon. We saw that in the United States. This has been an evolving, kind of market and challenge for the last 20 years. If you look at different segments, I think the fact that, tailoring and localizing functions to, say, the BRIC countries, which include, maybe having R&D and manufacturing market access within those countries, to maybe a different strategy for second-tier markets, where you go through local distributors and governments, and use price reductions to get access. To as far as, if you look at what some of the experts are saying about Africa and sub-Saharan countries, really focusing on partnerships within those countries and not necessarily, brick and mortar structures and infrastructure set up by each individual company. And the last thing I want to really hit on before we get to our speakers is this whole change in communication channels that really meet the changing needs of the healthcare marketplace. So if 5 years ago or 10 years ago, a pharma rep or a medical science liaison delivered everything from information to resources to peer collaboration, in Western markets and specifically in the U.S. And over the last 5 to 7 years, we've seen, medical websites, website companies, mobile apps, email, phone links, and social media take a huge role in either supplementing or replacing that knowledge that was formerly, transferred to the provider through the traditional commercial models that were in place at the time. So how these have changed and how these will continue to change, will really, be the focus on how you select what strategies you go forward with in your individual market. I think it's moved to a just-in-time, on-demand type of a communication, and whether that's product information, disease information, or patients requiring information about their individual therapies. I think it'll change and it'll be tailored according to the market you're in, and those who select and figure out what those next new communication methodologies will be, I think are going to be the winners in the long run. So kind of in conclusion, what does this all mean from a marketing standpoint? I think kind of recentering marketing on value creation within local markets and focusing on healthy outcomes is going to be quite important as you all develop a new commercial model within the China market. Taking a multi-stakeholder, multi-channel approach to this, figuring out which communication channels work most effectively with those stakeholders, I think is going to be a very key, important element of any strategy for a new commercial model here. Incorporating a focus on value creation early in the development cycle for the product, as new products and products have to be redeveloped in the China market to make sure that actual clinical practice experience and outcome-based thinking is put into the clinical trials will be very, very important. Really accelerating and reallocating the marketing mix or the marketing budget towards those elements that you feel work best in your individual market for your individual brand will be important. I can tell you from a Western standpoint that we were too slow in reallocating dollars towards the newer media. We held on to sales reps too long and samples too long. And the companies that innovated and went to the new technologies quickest ended up getting the greatest market shares in the long run. And then finally, I think the one thing that we ought to remember is that all this is good, but if we don't have rigorous measures in place to manage how we allocate and spend these funds and how we effectively, evaluate the ROI on their return, we'll never learn anything from it. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and turn it back over to Elliot to introduce our first speaker.